I watched a Star Wars film that doesn't exist. It makes me physically ill seeing the trailers this weekend. Star Wars Episode 9, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. When the hype starts, it skyrockets, and everything in your social media feed becomes Star Wars this and Star Wars that. Believe me, when I was a kid, this would have felt like Christmas to me. I grew up on Star Wars. I saw the second film, The Empire Strikes Back, in theaters with my dad, and made one of the greatest memories of my life. God rest his soul. For my birthdays, I would ask for Star Wars toys. As a teenager, when I got the Nintendo 64, I played Shadows of the Empire non-stop, despite being extremely bad at the game. It was my favorite franchise above all others. I was spurred on by my father, who actually worked as a merchandising consultant with Lucasfilms. He would even later be hired onto the Lucasfilm studio until his passing in 1988. I always found it weird back then. He used to talk about Star Wars all the time with me, often bringing home extra toys that he'd get from meetings and seminars. But the day after he was hired directly by the studio, it all stopped. I figured that now that he was part of the actual team, he just wasn't allowed to talk about the movies, like some sort of non-disclosure kind of thing. But that didn't really explain his demeanor, which slowly declined until he passed away. God, it makes my eyes water thinking about it. Well, in the summer of 1998, I had just graduated college, and I was desperately trying to get interviews for a job. After my fourth rejection call that week, I was more than distraught. I drank a lot that night. I borrowed some booze from my mother. I downed my favorite whiskey, the same kind my dad used to indulge in on the weekends. Now, I didn't get blackout drunk, but I came quite close to it. Close enough that I didn't remember much of the night before when I woke up in my bed in the morning. But apparently, I had been very busy before daylight. My room was absolutely thrashed. Collectibles had been torn open and tossed onto the floor. There was a hole in my door, and there was spilled alcohol all over my desk. But something else caught my eye. I had apparently pried up some of the hardwood floor. Rather than that part of the floor looking like it had been destroyed, it rather appeared to come away perfectly, like a puzzle piece. If I had to guess, it appeared that I had punched the floor in that spot, only to discover that the floor was false. What the hell, I thought to myself. We'd lived in this house ever since my dad was promoted back then. It's been several years, and I had never noticed this secret hole before. But maybe it hadn't been here that whole time, I wondered. Groggily, I tried to pick myself up from the bed, but I quickly felt vomit rising in my throat instead. I ran to the bathroom, relieving my sour stomach and washing myself up. I felt a bit better after that. As I exited the bathroom, I peered down the hallway to my mom's room. I could see that she was still asleep. Ever since Dad passed, she worked non-stop, fighting tooth and nail to keep the house despite the expensive payments. I sighed, grabbed a quick glass of water, then went back to my room, making sure that the door was shut. I turned the ceiling fan light on, then knelt in the floor. I pulled up the false wooden plank. I hovered my head over the hole and looked inside. There, I found a small rectangular black box. Being human, of course, my interest was piqued. I practically yanked the thing out and began to open it. Inside, there was a protective layer of velvet at the top that I pulled out, and underneath that was a folded up slip of paper that looked like it might crumble if I picked it up too quickly. Slowly, I used my thumb and index finger to lift it out of place. Then I laid it on my desk. Carefully, I unfolded it. Written in plain black Sharpie was a message, "This wasn't meant for you, son. I'm sorry that you found this." My heart seemed to stop in that moment. I recognized my dad's handwriting quite clearly. My mouth went dry and my breathing sped up. I desperately flipped over the note to see if there was more. This was a secret message from my father to me. Surely there had to be more to it. But there wasn't. Just an odd apology. Grinding my teeth, I was a little bit angry. I hadn't heard from him in years, and I would never see him again. Yet this was all his little secret note said. I shook my head and went back to the box. There had been one more thing within it, a rectangular object wrapped in an old rag. Slowly, I unwrapped it. Inside was a VHS tape, one that did not have any label or any brand name for that matter. Excitedly, I turned on my VCR, clicked on the TV, praying that the sound was low enough that the static and white noise wouldn't wake up my mother. Then I inserted the tape. It's hard to describe what I felt finding this strange tape alongside what was now my father's new last words. There was a joyful anxiety, but also a deep twist in my stomach. The blue screen appeared on the TV with a timestamp at the top right. After a few moments, the VCR displayed a big play sign at the top left. Then the video began to play. First, there was a black screen with a simple white text overlay at the bottom left that read, "Star Wars Project Saber." My mouth hung open. This wasn't real, right? The overlay then changed after about 10 seconds as the scene faded into view of space. It now read, "Death Star, Intensity Variation number 337. My mind was reeling. Star Wars was getting a prequel at the time, and my first thoughts on this was that my dad had hidden away footage of an old spin-off film, or perhaps another sequel that had been scrapped back in the day. I was beyond ecstatic at this, a lost sequel to my favorite film series. I was overcome with anticipation then. I would be only one of very few people who would see this. This was a gift from my dad, I thought. He wanted me to see this. I watched, leaning forward closer, as if I wanted the TV set to absorb me into it. The camera panned from a very realistic view of a star. As it turned, eventually a planet was revealed. A planet that was very obviously the Earth. I cocked my head to the side with confusion. We had never seen Earth in the Star Wars movies. As the intro roll sequence always stated, Star Wars took place in a galaxy far, far away. I kept watching, and I noticed that the camera's movement was extremely stiff. Perhaps this shot was scrapped because it was so badly made. Suddenly, the entire screen was covered in a bright yellow, almost white flash. It was so bright it hurt, forcing me to wince. The hangover didn't help at all. I covered my eyes and waited for the brightness to fade. After about 3 seconds, it did. What the hell was that? I wondered, rewinding the tape a bit to see what exactly happened. I grabbed the TV remote as well to turn down the brightness. Another blow to my bloodshot eyes like that and I'd probably black out right there. I pressed play and watched closely. The screen went bright, but I was now able to see something that I did not see before. There was a cylindrical arc of light. It was so fast that it appeared into existence immediately, stretching all the way down to the Earth itself. Jesus Christ, I muttered. These effects were astounding. Even as a kid, I could see how poor some of the CGI and lighting effects were in Star Wars. But this, I couldn't be sure that they weren't real. And then I saw where the arc extended to, smack dab in the center of what appeared to be Russia. The beam then disappeared instantly. Before I could understand what I'd just watched, the scene cut to black and another overlay appeared, reading, "Saber, Forceful Candidate, Trial Part Number 97. I repositioned myself and eagerly awaited to see what would come next. The scene faded into what appeared to be a small, smooth metal room. The camera was located directly in front of a strange chair or throne with a weird structure hanging just above it. The structure was a mess of wires and metallic appendages, the largest of which were two claws that ended in odd-looking mirrors on either side. It took about a minute for anything to happen, but when it did, I was dumbfounded. In walked two large uniformed soldiers, dragging a half-conscious man toward the throne. The man wasn't wearing any clothes, and the officers' uniforms were modern, not at all futuristic. At this point, I was certain that this wasn't an actual Star Wars film, or a theatrical film at all. They strapped the man to the chair as a voice was heard from behind the camera.
"Why is he awake? He's not supposed to be awake for this."
One of the soldiers looked up at the person talking and shrugged with a smile, replying,
"It's a little late for that now."
There was an exasperated sigh from behind the camera before the soldiers exited the room. The man strapped into the chair was beginning to moan, becoming more lucid by the second. Then the mechanism above began to move. The mirrored claws came down on either side of him and began to float about a foot away from his body. There was an audible clack from behind the camera, followed by a sound like a generator starting up. The screen went nearly white for a few seconds before the camera focused again. Glowing in front of the man between the mirrored claws of the mechanism was a 2-inch thick solid beam of light or energy. The man, now wide awake, was screaming, tugging at his restraints, but they did not budge. The mechanism floated to the right, then began to lower over what would be his left wrist. When it made contact, there was a loud, sickening hissing sound. The man cried out louder than before. The fingers on his left hand twitched and jolted and reached out desperately until they stopped. The hand had been separated completely at the wrist from the beam.
"Well done."
A new voice came from behind the camera, followed by a familiar one.
"Amazing."
My mouth was wide open. I hadn't blinked in what felt like ages. This was wrong. Why would my father hide a tape like this in my room? Was this some sort of artistic horror film? A body horror sci-fi movie? Or was it real? Because it definitely looked like it. Suddenly, there were more clacks behind the camera. The mechanism moved and widened itself so that the beam stood perpendicular to the man's torso. That's when the beam began to move toward him. The closer it got to his chest, the louder he cried, the more he screamed, and I realized that I had been screaming too. I quickly reached for the VCR, cutting off the power and yanking the tape out. I ran to the door and looked down the hallway. My mother was thankfully still asleep. Then I looked at the tape in my hand. I began to wonder why my dad had this and what it had to do with him. I remembered then hearing Dad talk about a different kind of Star Wars a long time ago. Back in 1983, I think, before I could remember, President Reagan had announced a new defense initiative he dubbed Star Wars. Of course, this idea was often ridiculed. A waste of taxpayers' dollars, they said. Defense systems in space were too far out. Pure fantasy, they said. But what I saw in that tape was very real. The following day, when my mother wasn't home, I dug through my dad's old stuff. There were old papers and documents from Lucasfilms, some name tags, his old suits, but nothing out of the ordinary. I went back to the false floor and pried it open, scanning it thoroughly to make sure there wasn't something there. When I found nothing, I fell onto my bed and wondered. Then it hit me. I began to scour every inch of the floors in the house. If my dad was hiding something as insane as that tape, then there must be something else hidden in this place. And bingo. Under my parents' bed on my mother's side was another false floor. I was trembling, nervous as I tore it open. Inside, I found a briefcase. I pulled it out and laid it on the floor, undoing the latches and opening it. My eyes flew open. There must have been several $1,000s there. I'd never seen so much money in one place. Then I saw the note taped to the upper part of the briefcase. Cautiously, I peeled the tape off and pulled the note closer to myself. It read, "My dear, I hope you find this when you need it. My dealings with the government have seen me gone from home too often. I miss you both beyond belief. Please see the attached document below these bills. Retain them until it is possible to give them to Andrian. Keep safe. If this document is recovered by them, I fear for our lives." The moment I finished reading it, I pulled the cash up from the briefcase and searched for the aforementioned document. It didn't take long to find a manila envelope, and inside was a typewritten file. The top revealed everything that I was horrified to see. Lucasfilms X Project Saber, Star Wars Initiative. I was hesitant to read the rest of it. This was as deep as rabbit holes went, but it was too late now. Too late to put it all back and pretend it never happened. The document went on to detail a collaboration behind the minds of Lucasfilms and government researchers to quote-unquote visualize new defense weapons. Defense weapons. What is defensive about burning an imprisoned man in half with a beam of pure light? I quickly hid everything back under the floorboard, all except for the cash, of course. Later that night, I gave the cash to my mother. She asked where I'd gotten it all. I simply replied that I had gotten very lucky with the scratch-off. "Very lucky, huh?" she said. She was suspicious at first, but too thrilled to question it. As for me, I haven't stopped questioning it. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that my father's death was no accident. It wasn't random. I was told that it was a heart attack, but that is BS. Considering the notes, he didn't know that he was going to die, but he did know his life would be in danger if they knew. But why did he place anything in my room? Unless he wanted me to be a part of it one day. My father was in deep here, and I know that the rabbit hole goes deeper. But if I dig any more, they might come after me and my mother.